We begin this evening with an assessment of America's war on terror. Joining me now from Washington is Anonymous, the author of a new book called Imperial Hubris. He is a veteran of the CIA, where he headed the Osama bin Laden task force between 1996 and 1999. He is still at the agency and was able to publish a book on the condition that his real name not be revealed. I am pleased to have him here on this program. I would assume also that the book, as all books by people who worked at the CIA, has been vetted by the agency. Welcome.
Thank you, sir, very much. I'm glad to be here.
Tell me what's your assessment of both the Senate Intelligence Committee report and what we know that's coming out from the 9/11 Commission.
The Senate report, I think, missed one important element, and that is, in the intelligence business, one of the most important things to ascertain is the person who delivers the intelligence to the president must not only deliver the analysis, but to give him a sharp and very clear description of the nature of the intelligence. Is it good? Is it bad? Does it come from opposition figures, for example? How reliable is it? And if that was not done, I think that in itself is a failure of intelligence.
But that's also an indictment of the former CIA director, George Tenet, isn't it?
Well, certainly my book is more or less an indictment of many of our senior leaders over the past dozen years in terms of senior civil service or senior departmental leaders.
Let me just stay with that idea, because it is central, it seems, to some of the problems that we are seeing. You know, whether it was Colin Powell's speech, because he was on this program on Friday night, and he made a speech before the UN Security Council, and much has been said about the information that he included in his speech and how he'd been to the CIA for a number of days to go over it, and how he and some of his colleagues at the State Department had rejected some things that were put forward. You know, the director of the CIA and people who prepare him to prepare the president look at all this, and if I understand you, it is very crucial that you make sure that you communicate and that you understand how reliable your information is and what is simply the best estimate you can get, and you know little about the reliability.
In many ways, Mr. Rose, the analysis is very important, of course, but in many ways the description of the nature of the intelligence is even more important. For an elected official who's going to make a decision of peace or war or any very difficult decision, the nature of the evidence must be explained in terms of its reliability and its sourcing. And from the Senate Select Committee report, it's not clear to me how thoroughly that was done.
Yeah. There is also this, and I'd love for you to have you expound on it, because it came out of the Senate Intelligence Committee report. It is the notion of the assumptions you use. And if, in fact, you believe something, you are more likely to dismiss something that goes counter to your idea, and therefore less likely to take a counter assumption, correct?
Yes, sir, I think that's exactly correct. And it's one of the worst things an intelligence officer can do is find something completely new, because it takes forever to get the mindset changed. In regard to my own book, the whole idea of Osama bin Laden being opposed to our democracy and our freedoms and our way of life, while he certainly dislikes all of those things, the war is not about that. But it's been extraordinarily difficult to change that mindset.
What is the war about?
The war is about our presence in the Middle East and a set of American policies that are perceived by many Muslims as anti-Islamic or anti-Muslim. And it's part of bin Laden's genius to have focused on that rather than the more amorphous issue of society and political systems.
Have we made it easier than we should have for him to make that argument?
Well, I think the big problem we have, sir, is he's focused on a limited number of policies which have been more or less on autopilot in the United States for the past 25 or 30 years. We really don't question our policies toward the Middle East or debate them. They kind of are consistent from administration to administration, and we have a hard time seeing that our policies are anything but benign. And we are not very good at picking up the degree of dissatisfaction in the Muslim world there is over these policies.
Why aren't we? I mean, this is basic, isn't it? I mean, the ability to see others, to see ourselves as others see us. Isn't that sort of fundamental to understanding to human nature?
Oh, I think it is fundamental, sir, and I think the majority of officers who work in the intelligence community certainly try to put themselves in the other guy's shoes. But over the past decade or more, we've become very politically correct in the terms of how we do analysis. The idea of saying that a culture is different than ours and perhaps holds some animosity toward us is difficult to argue. More especially, it's hard to argue or hard to advocate the position that religion has something to do with bin Laden's war on us and the motivation of his followers.
Is the problem at the CIA, in your judgment, and there are a number of problems in your book that you're suggesting, we want to explore more of them, is it more a problem not of the information they had or didn't have at the CIA, or you had or didn't have, i.e. you hadn't collected enough information, didn't have enough sources in Baghdad to tell you more what was going on, or in the countryside, or in the military of the Republic, of the Iraqi army? Is it more not having good information, or simply not understanding the information you had?
Sir, I'm really not at all an expert on Iraq, but I can address that question in terms of al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, if that's acceptable to you.
Of course.
Yeah. In terms of Osama bin Laden, there was never a shortage of intelligence or detailed information after about the middle of 1997. Anyone who worked on the al-Qaeda target in that period realized that we had discovered an entirely different type of organization, one we had never seen before, one that was larger and more lethal than any other terrorist group that we've ever worked against, and certainly one that was dedicated toward attacking us in the continental United States. So by mid-1997, there was really no doubt of what kind of animal we were facing. We had identified it. We had detailed much of what it was up to, and it's certainly not a question of intelligence, and it wasn't a question of understanding. If there is any enemy the United States ever had who made their intent more clear than Osama bin Laden, I don't know who it is.
Yeah, but we did not know the specifics of plans of attack against the United States. I mean, the operative assumption within the government, I think, was that, yes, Osama bin Laden and the al-Qaeda was preparing an attack against the United States, but they thought it would take place in Europe, where the the USS Cole and Kenya had taken place outside of the United States, and we had not seen or did not expect an attack that took place. That shows you our intelligence was what?
Well, again, I think the assumption of those senior civil servants who are talking to elected officials is much different than that of the people who are actually doing the analysis or those risking their lives to gather the intelligence in the field. But on a more general basis, all you had to do was read almost any statement bin Laden made after the summer of 1996, and it was clear he stated he's coming to the United States. He was going to inflict the same kind of attack that Ramzi Ahmed Yusuf did in the first World Trade Center attack in 1993. This was not a mystery.
How do you assess President Clinton, who has said that the note that he left President Bush when he left the White House was that the number one enemy was al-Qaeda? How do you assess his and his administration's response to the threat of al-Qaeda and what they did or did not do, whether strikes that they made and the camps that failed or other attacks?
Sir, I think that it's difficult to blame, and I try to make this point very clearly in the book, that it's very difficult to blame elected officials from either of the last two administrations, whether it was the 8 years of Mr. Clinton or this term of Mr. Bush. I think that they were not well served by many of their senior advisors. I know for a fact within my own experience that the intelligence about Osama bin Laden was always played down, was always denigrated. With the comparison now is that somehow the information on Iraq was sexed up. Well, in my experience, the information regarding Osama bin Laden was consistently sexed down.
Meaning what? I mean, I know basically what you
mean,
but
that
how
it was
it sexed down? People said, yeah, he's a loudmouth, but he's not serious, or he can only do so much harm? I mean, he doesn't have that many cells out there?
No, sir. I'm speaking specifically in terms of what they call these days actionable intelligence. Intelligence which would have given the United States an opportunity to either use its clandestine service to capture Osama bin Laden, or provide information to the military which would have let them use tools unique to the military to either kill him or capture him.
When was the easiest opportunity we had to kill or capture him?
We had multiple opportunities, sir, between I would say between May of 1998 and the spring of 1999. None of them were easy, sir. When you're operating in a place like Afghanistan, it's a very difficult terrain where our people were risking their lives to collect this kind of intelligence. But in my experience, there was always a reason proffered for not doing it. It was perhaps if he was meeting at this particular place, we might kill an Arab prince. If we attacked him at another place, a mosque might get hit by shrapnel. There was always that kind of an excuse or a reason for not attacking.
Okay, but just tell me this. Are you saying that people at the operational level, which you have spoken about a number of times in this conversation, they knew they could take him out? They knew where he was, they knew how to get to him, and if given the go-ahead, it could have made it happen?
What I'm saying, sir, is we had opportunities that were, well, let's put it this way. You can't have it both ways. We've had any number of officials from both administrations, senior civil servants or advisors, say that we knew from the middle 90s that Osama bin Laden intended to attack us with a weapon of mass destruction. Well, if that's your position going in, you cannot really argue that you have to wait until the information is perfect in order to try to preempt that attack. And in my experience on the bin Laden target, the requirement for quality information was such that it was impossible to achieve the level that people desired. In my experience, frankly, no one ever asked the question, why don't we err on the side of protecting Americans? The question always asked was, what will the Europeans say? What will the Saudis say? Won't Muslims be mad at us if we hit a mosque with some shrapnel from a missile?
So these
but
are all
no one ever
rather
asked.
Than operational judgments.
Well, even more than that, sir. More than they weren't even national judgments. To my mind, the intelligence community exists for only one thing, and that's to protect the American people. And if you don't frame your actions again in that context, you're failing miserably.
But here's what I'm perplexed by, and let me bore in. It is this notion of we had lots of intelligence about Osama bin Laden. If that's true, and we've had the help of the Pakistanis and other people, and we have certainly rolled up a number of key lieutenants of Osama bin Laden, and some were killed in Afghanistan under the heavy bombing that took place. Why haven't we been able to get him?
Sir, Afghanistan is a very large place. It's a place the size of Texas.
I understand, but you are also positing that we have very good intelligence, and with good intelligence you can pinpoint where somebody is, whether it's Austin or Dallas or Houston or El Paso.
Mr. Rose, that's true, but what I was discussing was a period of time before, say, the middle of 1999.
So we have less intelligence now than we did then.
I'm sorry, sir?
We have less intelligence now, notwithstanding the fact that we have in custody some of his principal lieutenants than we had in 98, 99.
Sir, we have tremendous intelligence now, as we did then. What we have less of now is locational information. The period before 1999 was one in which the target did not move around very much, and we were able to provide locational information. If you're talking about taking action, you have to know where the person is. He was a fairly sedentary man at that time, Now he's a man who is hiding in a country, as I said, the size of Texas, with the highest mountains in the world. It's become an extraordinarily difficult intelligence problem in terms of acquiring locational data.
And no amount of money spent in terms of both as incentive to people to help you will change that.
I think that's probably right, sir. You know, Afghanistan is one of the poorest places on earth, and we have now about $100 million or $150 million in reward money outstanding for Osama bin Laden, Ayman Zawahiri, other of their lieutenants. And no one's come forward. One of the biggest myths is that money can buy loyalty and treachery in Afghanistan, and that's just completely wrong. The American experience in Afghanistan over the last 20 years has been the Afghans will always take your money, but they will only do what they want to do.
You say on the cover of your book, Imperial Hubris, that why the West is losing the war on terror. Why are we losing it?
We don't know what we're fighting, sir. We continue to have officials, for example, say this war has nothing to do with the Islamic religion, that bin Laden and his like are gangsters or criminals. And that's just a delusion to argue anything like that, sir. Bin Laden's strength comes from the perception that American policies are attacking Islam. And as long as those policies stay in place, his potential for growth in terms of fighters, in terms of monetary support, in terms of just plain sympathy, is really unlimited.
But that always raises the question to me, which I frequently put to others, is has moderate elements within Islam done enough to separate themselves from and present alternatives within their own countries and within their own locations and within their own communities to bin Laden?
Sir, part of the genius of bin Laden is to have focused on policies that are anathema to Muslims, almost whether you would define them as conservative, radical, militant, or liberal or moderate. His focus on, for example, on our unqualified support for Israel, his focus on our presence now in the three holiest places of Islam, the Arabian Peninsula, Iraq, and the Israelis in Jerusalem. Our ability to manipulate oil prices to make them acceptable or palatable to the Western consumer. All of these things are issues which are gut issues for almost all Muslims. So it's very hard for a moderate voice to step out and talk against Osama bin Laden if it can be perceived as somehow supporting Israel or American policy toward Israel. It's a very difficult situation at the moment.
Musharraf would be one example.
Yes, I think President Musharraf is an example of a foreign politician who has done all he could to help us, but there are limits within his own society.
And he's been the subject of a number of assassination attempts as well.
Yes, sir, twice last December.
When you talk about war and endless war as
Yes, sir.
prescription, what do you mean?
It's not a prescription. I think what I'm trying to say is that's the choice. We're not in a place where we're choosing between war and peace, where we're choosing between war and endless war. Because I believe at least, because of our policies in the Middle East, we have left ourselves only with the military option. There's no one really listening to our public diplomacy, to our protestations of being even-handed between Muslims and Israelis or between Muslims and the West. And that's been true over the last decade. It's not unique to this administration. As long as that's the case, the war will continue. And unless we change our policies to some extent, we will be unable to undercut the growth potential for bin Ladenism, if you will. And that's the point I'm trying to make, is that...
Are you suggesting we have a different policy with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? and that's
I think
essential to changing our policy with respect to Israel and the Palestinians, and that conflict is essential to our likelihood of success in the war against terrorists who may be Islamic.
Mr. Rose, I would suggest that before you could even talk about changing a policy, you have to realize or accept as a nation that perhaps our policies are motivating the people who are attacking us and will continue to do that over time. When was the last time we had a discussion in this country or a debate in this country over our policies in the Middle East? You know, to even suggest that perhaps we should try to restrain the Israelis in some area, a person gets labeled an anti-Semite. We haven't had a good discussion on energy self-sufficiency in the last 20 years for a number of reasons. People don't want to pay higher prices. They want to protect the caribou in the Arctic nature reserve. These are issues that are on autopilot. They're not being discussed, and frankly, they're costing American lives right now.
But these are issues that, say, a number of people who are informed in the area of foreign policy, like Tom Friedman, the columnist for the New York Times, speaks to on a consistent basis: energy sufficiency and some of the difficulties that result from the inability to find a solution to the Israeli-Palestine conflict.
Yes, sir. And there's also our
so
support
he puts it in the debate.
I'm sorry, sir?
He puts it forward. He is one example. I realize that it's one thing to be a columnist for the New York Times, or another thing to be, a public official running for re-election to the American Senate or Congress.
Yeah, it is a very different thing, sir, but ultimately our policymakers and our politicians are going to have to debate these points. I think there's no way to get around it. And it may be a very difficult debate, but frankly, we will not make any progress against Osama bin Laden, except a body count, perhaps.
Where would you put this? How would you prioritize the point that you are raising now, that unless we change the perception of our own balance between Israel and the Palestinians, we will never get at the heart of the conflict with Osama bin Laden and other Islamic fundamentalist organizations?
I think I would put it on a very high priority, sir, but I would put all of the policies he's outlined on the same sort of priority. One of the biggest problems we've had is the revolution in media coverage in the Islamic world.
Because
the
Al
advent
Jazeera does what?
The advent of Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya, daily broadcasting from the West Bank, in seeing the fighting between Israelis and Palestinians, and with many more dead Palestinians than Israelis, certainly undercuts whatever protestations we can make that our policy is designed to help both sides. We need to do something about that particular issue, and we need to do it with some dispatch, I think.
Would it be fair to you, and fair to your book, if I said that it seems to me that you are making points that go to the heart of how America is perceived in the Gulf and the Middle East regions, how we are perceived there is, and changing that perception or changing things that lead to that perception is more important than our intelligence at the CIA and how it's presented to our leaders, which is an earlier point you made. I mean, as I listen to you, it seems more important you're saying that this perception is a much harder issue for us in confronting terrorism than it is what we know and don't know about them.
I think that's a fair summation, sir. I wrote an earlier book called Through Our Enemy's Eyes, which I tried to give to my countrymen, if you will, a way to understand how we're viewed overseas. And neither book is designed to argue that the enemy is correct. The enemy needs to be defeated. But I think we cannot defeat him until we accept the fact that we are perceived as aggressive people who are out to control Arab oil, and someone who's willing to do anything anti-Islamic in order to protect Israel.
And we cannot win the war on against terrorism unless we change.
I think we can't win it definitively, sir. I think we'll just continue to bleed both treasure and lives over the next, take your choice, 3, 4, 5 decades into my children's lifetime, surely.
Do you believe then, suppose then, let me take you down the Iraq thing, which I mean, you know, there's a, do you believe that the war against Iraq has created more terrorists than it has made America safer?
It was an unexpected and windfall gift to Osama bin Laden and those who think like him, sir.
Because it gave him a selling tool that he didn't have before.
Well, in a sense, and this is leaving aside Saddam Hussein and the threat he posed, which I am not conversant with to any significant extent.
Well, wait a minute. I don't understand that, because I mean, you know, do CIA people not talk to each other? I mean, they don't.
Well, you know,
you don't have conversations. If you're involved in the battle against terrorism, you don't have any conversations in Langley with people who are involved in Iraqi questions.
The only question on which we were involved into a
categorized that therefore people that ought to be talking to each other aren't talking to each other.
I think there is some of that, sir. And the only real issue we were involved in vis-a-vis Osama bin Laden in Iraq was the discussion of a possible relationship between Al Qaeda and the Iraqis.
What do you think the likelihood of the things that you think are most paramount are going to be changed?
I think it's a very long shot, sir, that we'll even discuss them. You know, the landscape is littered with American politicians who were labeled as anti-Semites for even raising the issue.
Is the reason for the not being identified, although there are certain publications, at least I know one, that has suggested your experience and your name, but is the reason that you don't want to appear in public and don't want to use your own name, is it you fear being called an anti-Semite, or is it something else about the nature of being a CIA officer?
No, it's not. It's a very simple explanation, Mr. Rose. I requested on this book to use my true name, and permission was denied.
So you were prepared to step forward?
Yes, sir. My employer decided that the book should be published with an anonymous author, and that I would not confirm my place of employment.
Oh, is your place of employment happy to see this book published?
I suspect it's probably not, sir.
Well, why didn't they? Okay, but is there no restriction on CIA officers? Let's assume it's a CIA officers writing books. I mean, aren't they? Can't they restrict what you do as long as you're an employee of the company?
Well, they certainly can, sir. My books, both of my books, were vetted through the system. Nothing was excised from them. But the only reaction to either book I received was a short note to say that I could publish if I remained anonymous and didn't identify my employer. Mm-hmm. This is a condition of publication. I thought it was more important to get the book out than to use my name. Mm-hmm. Although I resented, on the first book, I was accused of cowardice a couple times by people saying that I was hiding behind anonymity because of my views. That's not the case.
You'd be out there prepared to be risk calling an anti-Semite or whatever they may call you in order to put forward ideas that you think are important for the safety and national security of the country.
Well, you make it sound very heroic, sir. It's just kind of a citizen's duty.
I don't mean to do that, but
I would use my own name. I'm not ashamed of what I wrote or unable to defend it.
Let me go back to the Bush administration. Do you think they ought to have a new CIA director right away, or should they wait until change at the end of the political season?
Sir, that's the president's decision. I think we need a leader. I think there's a certain feeling that perhaps our last set of leaders ran away before these reports came out. So I personally, as just one member of the intelligence community, would love to see a new DCI.
George Tenet should view this as a serious critique of his administration of the CIA.
Again, sir, I know a little bit about a lot of things. I know a lot about Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda, and I think the information that was developed by the intelligence community would have provided multiple opportunities to bring this issue to a close in the late 1990s.
That's during the Clinton administration.
Yes, sir.
And the fact that the president didn't take them?
I'm not sure they ever got to the president, sir. That's what I mean by the failure in terms of senior civil servants or heads of departments. I'm not sure the president ever got this straight, Skinny.
Who should have gotten it from? His national security advisor, the CIA director? I mean, we know now that President Clinton didn't see the CIA director as much as President Bush sees the CIA director in a daily briefing. But he saw his national security advisor all the time. I mean, the lines between the National Security Council and the CIA should be very clear and busy.
Oh, I think they were, sir. I think one of the biggest problems was as I said earlier in our conversation, was decided an intentional denigrating of the type of intelligence that was delivered. We were delivering two messages that were rather schizophrenic. One, that bin Laden was going to attack the United States and perhaps use a weapon of mass destruction, and at the same time saying our evidence about his whereabouts was not good enough to act. It was a very strange, almost surreal experience.
How up to date is your information?
My information in what way, sir?
In terms of Al Qaeda or other similar terrorist groups operating, whether it's al-Zarqawi or whoever it might be.
Well, I can't speak, of course, sir, about classified information, but
I'm not going to ask you that. I'm just saying,
no.
but I don't want you to speak to it, but I want you to tell me, are you fully informed to the moment?
I'm still engaged very much in this particular issue, yes, sir.
And how close do you think any of these groups is to having a weapon of mass destruction as we traditionally know it? Or even a dirty bomb?
As we traditionally know it, sir, I think they don't have anything like a missile that can deliver a weapon. But in terms of biological weapons or chemical weapons or a suitcase nuclear bomb or a dirty bomb, I don't think we should rule out the possibility.
Do you think it's likely?
I think it's possible. We've known since the middle 1990s that Al Qaeda was pursuing the acquisition of a weapon of mass destruction with a very high degree of professionalism, a very large stock of technical knowledge so that they wouldn't get scammed by people trying to sell them a counterfeit or a fake weapon. That's a long time ago, sir. That's the better part of a decade. I would assume they have made progress since then.
Is that your most scariest thought?
No, sir. My most scariest thought is right now that most of the American people, and for better or worse, a lot of our leaders don't really understand the nature of this war, its severity, and the lethal threat it poses to the United States. To really change our lives, our lifestyle, reduce us to a very much more a crabbed society in terms of travel, the openness of our society, our ability to visit government buildings or museums. In the long run, this has a very strong potential of changing our lifestyle.
Unless we change our policy.
Well, unless we change, we have to do it across the board, as in any war we fought, World War I or II or Korea. There has to be a panoply of policies. There has to be policies that less alienate the Muslim world. There has to be some kind of an economic dimension, a diplomatic dimension, and a military dimension, frankly. These are not people that are going to give up simply because we start saying nice things. There has to be a combination of policies that are addressed to them.
Some would say that when they listen to you say that, they would say Osama bin Laden is simply about power. It's not about, he's not driven by the ideology of his American hatred. He's driven by power, and he's driven by the fact that he wants to change the regime in Saudi Arabia. He wants to overthrow the royal family, and America simply stands in the way of that.
Well, that's certainly part of his goal over the long term. What he's done is focus so many of the Islamic militants in the world on the United States rather than on Saudi Arabia or Egypt or Algiers, because those governments are simply too strong to take on. They're police states, they're immune to international opinion, and they don't mind losing their own people and fighting battles. We, on the other hand, are the opposite of all those things. I sincerely think, sir, that if we look at bin Laden as simply a power politician, we're going to end up on the losing end of this struggle.
And we have to understand him in the context of Islam and how he perceives and how he's able to convince people who might either follow him, serve his interest, or give him money that America is the enemy of Islam?
I think that's exactly right, Mr. Rose, and I get criticism for sounding like an apologist for him, but really the book is nothing if not an appeal to be a bit more nationalistic in the defense of the United States, to act more resolutely in different areas, but certainly to realize how we're perceived in the Muslim world as malignant.
Bruce Hoffman is editor-in-chief of Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, a senior fellow at Combating Terrorism Center at the U.S. Military Academy, written a book called Inside Terrorism. Says, Anonymous has now written the two most important books on terrorism currently available. Peter Bergen, who's been on this program, CIA terrorism expert, says no serious observer of the war on terrorism can ignore this scathing critique of the Bush administration's policy since 9/11, made all the more powerful by the fact that the author's previous book was a comprehensive and authoritative account of the rise of al-Qaeda. I thank you for joining us this evening.
Mr. Rose, it's my pleasure. Thank you very kindly.
Thank you. We'll be back in a moment. Stay with us.